You're here in the SEL education community, and I want to welcome you all once again to the next installment of our SEL education speaker series. I'm really excited to be able to bring back again to talk with you all Jordan Posamentier, the Director of Advocacy at Committee for Children, who's going to talk with us about culturally responsive teaching in social emotional learning, kind of in a continuation of the series we've been doing, talking about the intersection of equity and social emotional learning. So Jordan, thank you very much for coming back and joining us again today. I think this is a really interesting topic. I think it's worth us kind of starting off by just defining what culturally responsive teaching is. I know there can be a lot of different ways that we understand and look at it.
Yes. Thank you for having me again, Matt. And you are right. There are going to be a lot of different ways to interpret the topic we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to do it imperfectly. I'll say the idea here generally is to validate and affirm cultural experiences both inside and outside the classroom. Teaching that acknowledges and incorporates students' culture can improve academic success. It can help with critical thinking, sense of community, and interpersonal skills. That's the general world we're living in when we're having this conversation. More specifically, for Committee for Children, as far as policy is concerned, we're relying on the University of Washington College of Education's Dr. Geneva Gay's definition, which is that culturally responsive teaching uses students' cultural knowledge, their experience, their perspectives in instruction to increase relevance and efficacy of student learning.
So what are the implications then for racial equity in education?
Yes, and this builds on some of the conversations we've been having in the past parts of the series. I think bottom line is all kids want to be known. They don't necessarily want your attention all the time. They want to be known. They want to belong. They want to feel accepted. Culturally responsive teaching helps with all of that. It's especially important to have a positive regard for one's racial identity. That's what the research tells us, where that identity faces discrimination and systemic barriers in education. If you get all these negative messages about your race from media, leaders, entertainment, and elsewhere, schools can really be a place to turn that around. And in school, culturally responsive practices help make a safe and supportive environment. They can interrupt those harmful student behaviors like silencing, teasing, bullying, microaggression. It can work also to foster support between peers. So you take away the damaging behavior, you introduce supportive behavior, like providing students with activities to cultivate their agency, improve their sense of belonging. Relating students' cultural experiences to the classroom, like I said, that's going to help with academic achievement. It's going to help enhance students' motivation to learn. The other thing we mentioned earlier in the series, and I'll hit on this again, racial trauma can produce negative systemic impacts on academic opportunity. Our best understanding of what's going on now during the pandemic is that's only getting more pronounced. And culturally responsive teaching, again, this is a positive antidote to help treat that, at least in part.
Mm-hmm. So where does social emotional learning come into this? How is SEL implicated in culturally responsive teaching?
Sure. So think of these two provinces, SEL, culturally responsive teaching, as mutually reinforcing. Both can help build safe and supportive learning environments. They do this in different ways, or they do it in the same way, we just think about them a little differently based on our frame. So like culturally responsive teaching does this through SEL competencies of self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills. It encourages teachers to learn about and recognize kids' distinct backgrounds. SEL, on the other hand, builds a safe and supportive learning environment by tuning SEL lessons towards student strengths, such as self-awareness, relationship skills.
So is there policy responding to this need? Is there this is always the part that I'm really interested in hearing from you, is so where does policy and advocacy fit in with this?
It's always my favorite part. I'm the policy guy. So always is the answer. So across the country, culturally responsive education legislation it's still in its nascency, but it's taken off. There are states going at it. There's federal examples that support it. I'll give you a couple examples. This past year, Minnesota, for example, they introduced a bill, HF6, if you're curious. The other one was SF31. They would require comprehensive plans to improve teaching and learning to include culturally responsive pedagogy. So it's professional learning for educators or educators to be. These bills also establish, just so you know, standards of social, emotional, and cognitive development. They haven't made it to the finish line, but it's important they were introduced. Last year, something similar happened in New York. They introduced a couple of bills. On the Assembly side, it was 3648. On their Senate side, it was 2937. They would establish culturally responsive education curriculum and standards. So they're starting to anchor this concept into policy.
Hmm.
At the federal level, a good example is the Teacher Diversity and Retention Act. That was introduced last year. I would not be surprised if it comes out again in 2021. Those produce authorizing grants to include culturally responsive teaching, as well as SEL competencies in educators' certification or preparation.
Hmm.
So you might be noticing a trend here. The trend in the policy space, both at state and federal, is to help educators get better at this dimension of teaching and learning.
Hmm. So, and just to be clear, these are all bills that have been introduced, but nothing has been enacted into law yet.
Yes, that's right. There are policy efforts going on below the legislative level.
Hmm.
Too many to talk about now, but know that those are also getting built into
Hmm.
everything from certification to opportunities to get clock hours for PD.
Oh, cool. So that's ends up being a very practical sort of way to address this.
Yes.
So, what are ways that the folks here in the community can learn more about this? How can they take action? Is there any action that we can take to help support this?
Sure thing. One is I would encourage everyone to read the SEL and racial equity brief. It covers this issue. What's helpful about reading that brief per this issue is it puts it in context. There are a series of other policy interventions to consider beyond culturally responsive that I think if you see it nested across the spectrum, you'll get a better sense of how this plays out in practice. The other thing you might consider looking at New York's culturally responsive sustaining education framework. They produced one. I can't tell you how well that's translating into implementation in the field, but it's a helpful framework to look at anyway. If you're looking to develop something a little bit more robust and formal, uh, that could serve as a possible model for your work or your state's work. If you live in Minnesota or New York, I would especially encourage you to reach out to your state lawmakers, learn more about what they're doing in this space, advocating that legislation. There's a good chance it'll just keep coming back and moving forward. And that's how legislation works, right? Everybody knows, I don't know if everybody knows. State legislatures, they're designed not to have bills passed. So it takes many steps to get a bill from the beginning to the end. It's no surprise they haven't gotten to the end yet. We just have to keep working at it. Oh, last thing. Sign up
Hmm.
to receive action alerts
Yes.
from Committee for Children at key times
Hmm.
so that you can have that conversation with your state or federal government for policy and advocacy that we all care about.
Hmm. Yeah. So, and this is really important. I think the people hearing voices from people in the field, um, uh, this means a lot to politicians when they hear this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Everyone knows someone with a kid
Hmm.
and can relate to the need to belong in
Hmm.
school, can relate to the need that schools become a little more complicated this last year, on
Hmm.
top of the complications we'd already been experiencing.
Hmm.
I'll also say that most of us know somebody either in our family or in our friendship circles who's a teacher.
Hmm.
And we know that teachers are doing their best to get it right. It is not a simple or easy job. It is a meaningful job. And the more that teachers feel like this is an aspect that's honored and respected in
Hmm.
their pedagogy, I think the better off we all are.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate that focus on on helping teachers kind of be able to do this work, because I've certainly heard educators say that they would love to be able to do this, but it's not something they can just saying be culturally responsive isn't enough. There needs to be a framework behind that. There needs to be support behind that for
Yeah.
them. And so this kind of helps educators do the work that they're hoping to be able to do and they want to be able to do.
Yeah. Not to get too academic, but policy does a lot of things for the folks in the field. And one thing it does is it gives you permission. It says from the policymakers, we value this. Go take time and do it. The other thing it does is we support this. We're going to fund
Hmm.
the opportunity to get better at this. Those two things are absolutely essential, and it's very hard to do without having both of them in place.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jordan, I want to thank you again for joining us today, and to let everybody know that you're going to be back again in a couple of weeks to talk with us a little bit more about different elements of how social emotional learning intersects with equity in education. But until then, I'm going to say thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's watching online. We appreciate you joining us as well.
Thanks, Matt.